Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 120 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, for Monday Gun Day, I've got Mike Ooley back in the studio to talk about the ATF's new final rule regarding what it means to be engaged in the business of selling firearms, such that it would require a license, an FFL, to sell or to be in compliance with their dictates. So, Mike, welcome back to the studio.
Hey, good morning, Alex. I think your introduction is apropos because it was an awfully long sentence to explain what a deal, to even define the issue. And I think that's what we're going to discover as we get in this more today, is this is a rather complicated mess that the ATF is purposefully created.
Well, I'm going to read part of the statement from the Department of Justice and the ATF here momentarily, but this is a final rule that really stems back to, it depends on how far back in history you want to go, back to the Gun Control Act and the Firearm Owners Protection Act, but most recently to the so-called Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which you should know is no good when it's got such a friendly sounding name like that. Of course, it was bipartisan, and that means that there were a number of Republicans that supported it and Democrats as well. But it was primarily a gun control bill, and it did a number of things. But I'm going to show you that bill here in just a moment.
Yeah, and we talked about last week. One of the things that it did was it's trying to strengthen and beef up what's going on around the country with respect to red flag laws. Yeah. This week, we're going to talk about something else that it did.
Right. So it was adopted. It passed in June of 2022. Of course, now we're in April of 2024. So it's been a couple of years since the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was passed. But one of the things that it did is to redefine what it means to be engaged in the business. Okay. So this is the actual law that the rule we're going to talk about stems from. And that's important to remember here at the outset, is that the ATF rule, that the ATF cannot make or create the law. The legislature does that, and they did that through the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act.
Now, that's not to say that the ATF doesn't unconstitutionally make law from time to time, or actually frequently. But in this instance, we have Congress at least arguably giving them some shade here to go out on a limb,
to operate underneath
and criminalize further conduct that they think is undesirable in society.
So Congress makes the law, and then the ATF is tasked with enforcing that law through their rulemaking authority as an executive branch agency. And of course, we've talked about that a little bit in the past as well, how various executive branch agencies, not just the ATF, have gone beyond their rulemaking authority into the arena of creating law. And they do that to some degree here as well. We're hopeful that, I just want to mention this real quickly, that the Supreme Court will limit executive branch agency authority through the Loper-Bright case, which is currently before it. But of course, we can't rely on the non-black robes in Washington to protect our freedom either.
No, and fortunately, we've got, in the next couple of months, we're going to have a lot of news coming out of the Supreme Court, I think. So we'll wait and see. Can I say a couple things about the Safer Community Act thing? Number one, it's bipartisan. And of course, we had sometimes the Republicans are no better than the Democrats, but at least I'd like to shout out to my piece of crap, Senator Todd Young, in Southern Indiana here, who supported this bill. One of, I think, 14 senators. I also like to mention John Cornyn, Cornyn from Texas, who put in his name to be the next majority leader in the Senate. And of course, Mitch McConnell voted for this as well. So those are folks we'd like to give them credit for expanding federal government authority and allowing the ATF to grab this power. It's important to understand, I think, the legislature, the Safer Communities Act, before, if you were a dealer, there were two principal things that the ATF had to demonstrate to say that you were a dealer, so that you have to provide or have to get a federal firearms license, and that was whether you were doing the sales for principally for your livelihood and to make a profit. Well, this new Safer Community Act changed that and said that you would be a dealer if it's just done, if what your activity is doing is being done predominantly to earn a profit. So that's what changed in the legislature.
Took out the livelihood portion of it. Yeah.
So that's what changed. And then the ATF went on this spree of rulemaking, and I downloaded it. It was 466 pages to clarify the what the legislature did, what Congress did. So obviously, anytime that a federal agency publishes 466 pages of clarification, be leery of the situation.
Yeah. So I want to mention, I put up on the screen here the Ballotpedia website, which shows the 14 Republicans who voted for this bipartisan bill. Of course, this was from the House. You can see 14 Republicans here, including one from Michigan. And of course, the Senate, which you mentioned earlier, had the likes of Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham and John Cornyn and Todd Young, of course, who supported this bill. So this is bipartisan, although there aren't very many Republicans. It's a stretch to call it bipartisan, but there were enough Republicans who were willing to take away our liberty to support this bill. So this bill, and I'm going to show you the bill, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Mike alluded to the length of the final rule, which is supposed to give us clarification, 466 pages. The bill, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which they are trying to clarify, is 32 pages. Okay. And this engaged in the business portion of that 32-page bill doesn't start until page 12, the bottom of page 12. And it runs about half a page, maybe a little more. So the ATF took 466 pages to clarify a page. Okay. And they expect us to comply with that clarification. So that's what we're going to talk about here in just a little bit. Now,
in all seriousness, I want to think about this, the context of this a little bit historically, though, if you would too, please, as you're listening to what we talk about when we get into the rule. The ATF is the agency that, people have heard of Randy Weaver and Ruby Ridge. The ATF suspected him of, I think, possessing, or I think it was an entrapment situation, but he had a sawed-off shotgun or two. And, of course, the ATF killed his wife and, I think, daughter or child. These are the folks that killed 70-some-odd folks at Waco. ATF. Actually, the FBI got involved in that after the ATF initially screwed up. And these are the people who killed the executive with the airport in Little Rock just a few days ago, went to serve a warrant. The guy was accused of basically being a dealer and not having a license. So the theme here, we've got Ruby Ridge, we've got Waco, we've got the executive at the Arkansas airport killed. Interesting enough, I understand the ATF, despite what they're supposed to have, didn't have any body cams at the time. And of course, they killed the gentleman. So sometimes we joke about the bureaucracy in Washington or even at the state level. But these folks, if they think you're in violation of these ambiguous rules, they will send men, I guess sometimes women, and they will kill you. That's what they do.
Yeah.
So in all seriousness, folks should really pay attention to this and be alarmed by the expansion of the bureaucracy, because it's not just you're going to get a traffic ticket. I mean, they kill people.
Yeah. They're mostly a criminal organization, and they hate competition. So they want to enforce their monopoly on violence. But anyway, I want to set the stage here. This is a statement from Stephen Dettelbach, the director at the ATF. He says, and this is referring to the final rule that we're going to talk about, this is about protecting the lives of innocent, law-abiding Americans as well as the rule of law. There is a large and growing black market of guns that are being sold by people who are in the business of dealing and are doing it without a license. Now, that sounds pretty crazy, right? A nefarious thing to do, to sell something that we can lawfully have without a license.
And since the beginning of this country, there's been no law against the private sale of a firearm.
Yeah. And therefore, they are
Strike
not
that. You can't, but prohibited persons and that sort of thing.
And therefore, they are not running background checks the way the law requires. And it is fueling violence. Today's final rule is about ensuring compliance with an important area of the existing law where we all know the data show, and we can clearly see that a whole group of folks are openly flouting that law. That leads to not just unfair, but in this case, dangerous consequences. Of course, we don't have any examples of those dangerous consequences except the ones that you referenced where the ATF has killed lots of folks.
Yeah. And what people need to understand about this propaganda, and it's beautifully written. I mean, Goebbels would be proud of this. What people need to understand, what's behind this redefinition of who's going to be a dealer is they want universal background checks. When there's an incident involving a murder, what do? They stand on the graves of the dead people. And despite the fact that the murderer has probably gone through a background check to buy the firearm that's involved in the murder, they immediately call for background checks, even though background checks would have had no impact on the deaths of the graves, on the deaths of the people involved in the incident. This is what they want. And why do they want that? They want universal background checks because that's the only way they can ultimately determine where all of the guns are in the country. When they know and they can follow those guns and they know where they're at, the follow-on to that is where
they can find all the guns owned by law-abiding
citizens. Of course, criminals are never going to abide by the law.
Right.
But when they can find all the firearms that every law-abiding citizen owns, the next step is going to be registration and confiscation. Yeah. So that's what this is all about. And you may think, oh, this doesn't apply to me because I don't want to be a dealer. I buy a firearm every once in a while and I keep them. I don't buy and sell. That's not the case. They want to catch everybody so that every firearm transfer is recorded with the federal government so they can begin the confiscation process down the road.
This reminds me of, I'm going over a decade back for this one. I don't remember who said it, but it was during the discussion about the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act provisions.
Yeah, how's that worked out?
And of course, the nobody thought that the Affordable Care Act would actually solve the issues that they perceived with healthcare. But there was some, and I can't remember who said this, so somebody on the internet will figure this out, and maybe I'll go back and look. They said it's not really about the Affordable Care Act. It's just about getting the system a little bit pregnant, and you can't go back once you're a little bit pregnant. And what they meant by that was once we introduce this step toward universal health care, it's not about that step. It's about getting closer to universal health care. And that's what this is. That's what this is, really. It's not about protecting people. It's not about safety. It's about control. And it's about taking an extra step down the road to universal background checks and complete control. All right, so that's what this is all about. It's got nothing to do with what the director, Steve Dettelbach, says here. Like you said, Goebbels would be proud. I'm going to play just a short clip here. This is just to give you a little bit of an idea about who Steve Dettelbach is here. He's answering a question about what an assault weapon is.
Military veteran. I have some expertise in weaponry and self-defense weapons. What could you, in 15 seconds, would you define an assault for me?
So
if you go past 15 seconds, I'll just interrupt you.
Yeah, so I'll go shorter than that because I honestly, I do think if Congress wishes to take that up, I think Congress would have to do the work, but we would be there to provide technical assistance. Unlike you, I'm not a firearms expert to the same extent as you may be, but we have people at ATF who can talk about velocity of firearms, what damage different kinds of firearms cause, so that whatever determination you chose to make would be an informed one.
Okay, so there you have it. That's Steve Dettelbach. He is not as an expert on firearms like the representative there, but
Seems like his expertise is probably more in propaganda.
Yeah, but surely somebody at the ATF can chime in on these issues. So anyway, we've got, as I showed you earlier, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act is 30-something pages with a portion of it devoted to firearms and what it means to be engaged in the business. So then, based on that, 2 years, well, it's been a longer process than that, but just a couple of weeks ago, not even, the ATF published its final rule, which is 466 pages. And I'm going to pull that up here.
And that rule is designed to help us figure out if whether someone's activity is done predominantly to earn a profit. And if it is, with respect to the sale of a firearm, you're going to be a dealer.
And actually, before I pull up the actual final rule, I want to share the statement here from the ATF and the Department of Justice. It says, Justice Department publishes new rule to update definition of engaged in the business as a firearms dealer. They say, under this regulation, it will not matter if guns are sold on the internet, at a gun show, or at brick and mortar store. If you sell guns predominantly to earn a profit, you must be licensed and you must conduct background checks. This was Attorney General Merrick Garland. This regulation is a historic step in the Justice Department's fight against gun violence. It will save lives. Again, another expert, maybe not in guns, but in propaganda. So that's what they are proposing to do with this final rule, is to close these so-called loopholes and to make anyone who is selling firearms predominantly to earn a profit to have to obtain a license to do so. So what does that mean, right? And we'll talk about what they say that means here by looking at the bill. The bill, take me just a moment to get it pulled up here. And if you're watching this podcast by video, you can see here on my screen at the top, it says 466 pages. And of course, it includes a summary of what they say this rule does. And it's primarily, like we said, to take out this livelihood portion of the bill, of the law.
But and to define how if you're predominantly engaged in this buying and selling of firearms to earn a profit. And I think one thing is, if you can go to it, there are certain things they basically list that says if you're engaged, if you do these things, there's a presumption that you're a dealer, and they list those things. And like I said, there's 466 pages to describe that. Are you going to scroll to that now?
I am.
We'll wait for him.
All right.
So here's the presumption.
Page 28.
So they start
in this clarification. All right. They say presumptions that a person is engaged in the business. The NPRM, which means Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, pointed out that the department has observed through its enforcement efforts, regulatory functions, knowledge of existing law, and subject matter expertise that persons who are engaged in certain firearms purchase and sales activities are more likely than not to be engaged in the business. And so they've identified those, apparently, through their expertise, and they've listed those presumptions here. And what they've said is that they've identified, I think it's 6 categories where you fall into the presumption. And those are here. Okay. Number 1, sells, and this is on page 32, sells or offers for sale firearms and also represents to potential buyers or otherwise demonstrates a willingness and ability to purchase and sell additional firearms.
So if I sell you my Remington 1148 and 410 and say, Alex, I've got a Model 28 too. I might sell you someday. I want to go through the dove season and I'll think about selling that to you.
Presumptive dealer.
Oh, they're going to show up. Maybe, and if I don't, and if they show up at 5:30 and I think it's somebody breaking into my house and I show up at the front door with a firearm, they're going to shoot me, right? Right. Kill
Yep,
me. That's
yep,
right.
Exactly. That's how they're going to enforce it.
Okay.
Number 2, spends more money or its equivalent on purchases of firearms for the purpose of resale than the person's reported taxable gross income during the applicable period of time. So
Right.
you're hard up for money, you lost your job, you have no income,
Retired,
you're
maybe.
retired, you sell a firearm, dealer.
Even though I have savings that would allow me to buy a firearm. Okay.
Number 3, repetitively purchases for the purpose of resale or sells or offers for sale firearms. Okay, repetitively, how? Okay, they say through straw or sham businesses or individual straw purchasers or sellers, or B, that cannot be lawfully purchased or possessed, including stolen firearms, firearms with serial numbers removed, etc.
So it sounds like what they're trying to get here is they're wanting to also criminalize an otherwise already criminal act of stealing a firearm, straw purchasing, reselling firearms in the black, all of which are already crimes, but they want to add some more criminal statutory
some more clarification.
gravy and clarification. Okay.
Yeah. And of course, we say clarification sarcastically. Number 4, repetitively sells or offers for sale firearms within 30 days after they were purchased that are new or like new in their original packaging, or that are the same or similar kind. Okay.
So don't keep them in an original box. I'm not sure. Well, of course, we got the repetitively. I don't know if that's 2.
That's 1 every year.
Yeah.
Is that, we don't have no idea what that means.
But they're in their original packaging. That's not a good idea. That's for sure.
Yeah. All right. Number 5. As a former licensee or responsible person acting on behalf of the former licensee sells or offers for sale firearms that were in the business inventory of such licensee at the time the license was terminated and were not transferred to a personal collection in accordance with federal statute.
So we know that the ATF is trying to force federal firearms licensed dealers out of business. Now they're trying to make sure that those guns are properly sold in terms of providing data to the federal government as to where they went. That's what sounds like what they're looking for there.
So there you go. Those are 5 circumstances where the ATF says there are other circumstances where you could be determined to be a dealer, but these circumstances would give rise to a presumption that you're a dealer.
Yeah.
Okay. And you can see how just an ordinary private sale could be caught up in this ambiguous language. And of course, they go on and they say the proposed rule provided that any one circumstance or combination of the circumstances set forth above would give rise to a rebuttable presumption that the person is engaged in the business of dealing and firearms and would need to be licensed.
So we've got a rebuttable presumption in those circumstances. Those things use vague and ambiguous language. But what's the most alarming to me is the catch-all. If you're ready to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Let's get
into that. Is you can go to page 457 pages in. At least that's where I've noted it, made a little highlight here. They've got this fact-specific inquiry. And I don't like to read to people, but I'm going to read just a little bit here. And they say whether a person, ultimately, this is a fact-specific inquiry for them, meaning that they're going to get to determine based on what they think the facts say. Whether a person is engaged in the business as a dealer is fact-specific. And I'm editorializing here a little bit and cutting out some of the legal jargon. There's no minimum number of transactions that determines whether a person is engaged in the business of dealing in firearms. For example, even a single firearm transaction or offer to engage in a transaction, when combined with other evidence where a person represents to others a willingness to, and ability to purchase more firearms for resale, may require a license, whereas a single isolated firearm transaction without such evidence would not require a license. At all times, the determination of whether a person is engaged in the business of dealing in firearms is based on the totality of the circumstances. So what will happen is they basically have a catch-all. They can do what they want. They'll go to a judge. The judge will, as most judges do, they'll just routinely grant the warrant, and the ATF will show up with 10 SUV loads of armed federal agents to serve a search warrant in your home. if they've got it out for you. That's what it amounts to.
And that totality of the circumstances language means whatever we want it to mean, essentially. So
Yep.
whatever we can convince a judge to agree with us on, that's going to meet that totality of the circumstances analysis. Okay. Essentially, we're going to ask, as a government agent, we're going to ask a government judge to approve our interpretation of our own rules.
Yep. That's what they do.
Yeah. All right. And that language, even a single firearms transaction. So that's, I mean, they could have just said that in this entire clarification. Even a single transaction, a single sale, if we think you're a dealer based on the totality of the circumstances, for whatever reason, you're a dealer, right? That's essentially what's going on here. And they mention that language. I'm going to try to find it here. On page 31 is where they mention that language for the first time. They say, even a single firearm transaction or offer to engage in a transaction when combined with other evidence may be sufficient to require a license. How's that for clarification? Right. All right.
Yep.
So like we said, Mike, this is not going to solve any crime. Or I shouldn't say any. They may solve a few here and there based on this, but this is going to do more to wrap up individual law-abiding citizens in the morass of these dictates, these ambiguous rules, than it will ever to stop a crime. Do you think that a criminal is going to look at this rule and think, oh man, I should really go get my FFL?
Yeah, there are criminals out there today just breezing through this 466 pages to make sure that they comply with this. No, this is just going to catch up the innocent, law-abiding citizen, and they're going to get caught between a government judge, a government bureaucrat, government lawyers, and they're going to have to try to fight these folks with enormous resources that they have from tax money and borrowed money. And you're going to be in a world of hurt because it's going to be difficult for you to challenge whatever fact-specific finding the ATF decides is appropriate.
And of course, it's going to increase the cost of private firearms transactions. So for people like you and me, if I want to sell you a firearm and I don't know you, even if I do know you, based on this rule, I'm going to want to conduct that sale through an FFL or be reluctant even to do that because I might be considered a dealer in my own right. So it's going to increase the cost if I have to obtain a license to sell a firearm, which is just crazy. And of course, that's the whole point of this, is to increase the cost to chill the transaction of firearms. And to require that any transaction involves a background check, which will eventually lead to registration.
Yeah, just keep in mind what this is designed to do ultimately is they want a registration, because you have to have registration before you can begin confiscation. Because Dettelbach and folks like him would love nothing better for Congress to define certain scary firearms, call them, quote, assault weapons, end quote. And then they would have the data to know where they're all at, so they can come and start trying to take firearms from folks.
I'm going to link to the final rule in the show notes so you can go read it for yourself. But I've also pulled up here, this is page 47, their definition of what it means to predominantly earn a profit. Because remember, that's a large part of what this rule does, is it takes out the part about earning a livelihood from the sale of firearms. It takes that out and says if it's to predominantly earn a profit. Well, what does that mean? Okay, and here's what the ATF says that means. That the notice of proposed rulemaking also explained that the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act broadened the definition of engaged in the business as a dealer by substituting to predominantly earn a profit with the principal objective of livelihood or profit. And they go down here, and one of the first things they say is that clarifying that proof of profit proviso, i.e. the BSCA's provision that proof of profit shall not be required, Okay. As to a person who engages in regular and repetitive purchase and disposes of firearms for criminal purposes or terrorism. Okay. What does that mean? And what if, what does criminal purposes or terrorism mean? And does, so if you sell something and it's not for a profit, but it's for a criminal purpose or terrorism, you could get caught up in this. Okay. Even though the definition is to predominantly earn a profit. Okay. The clarification says, oh, well, actually, it doesn't have to be for a profit. All right. But then it goes on and it says, neither the pre-BSA definition of with the principal objective of livelihood and profit, nor the post-BCA definition of predominantly to earn a profit requires the government to prove that the defendant actually profited from the firearms transactions. Okay? So you can see how it would be easy to get caught up in their interpretation of this rule because words don't really have any meaning in their definitions.
Up is down, down is up.
Yeah. Okay. So, and they go on and they talk about what they believe it means to predominantly, what their interpretation of to predominantly earn a profit means. And like I said, we won't read through all of that here, but I've linked to it and you've got the page reference now in the show notes. So, Mike, anything else you want to say about this before we close up? I'm going to share. We've got a few other things we want to mention.
Well, just to understand what this is for, ultimately registration, confiscation. Remember, and I couldn't remember his name earlier. I looked it up here. His name was Brian Malinowski. He was, I think, the executive director at the airport in Little Rock, Arkansas. And he had been accused, from what I understand, and all I know is what's in the press, he was accused of selling firearms, buying and selling firearms, and the ATF evidently thought that he should have a federal firearms license. They were going to serve a warrant on this guy who was lived in a very nice home, had a very nice salary, and I guess they showed up early in the morning, didn't turn their body cams on, didn't have body cams, put a piece of tape, if you believe the press results or the press accounts, put a piece of tape over his doorbell that had video associated with it, and then broke into his house and ultimately killed Brian Malinowski for purportedly selling firearms without a license. I suspect that it wouldn't have been very difficult to have not killed Brian Malinowski for this, but that's what the ATF does in a lot of circumstances.
Yeah.
They will kill you if you violate these rules, or they think you violate these rules.
And I've pulled up the Federal Register here. This, whenever a rule is published, it takes effect sometime after its publication. And it has, in fact, been published. I'll link to this in the show notes as well. But it will take effect, you'll see, May 20th, 2024. So just a little less than a month away before this rule takes effect. And it's, it's available at this link as well. I'll link to the rule itself and then also to the Federal Register here. The other thing I want to mention before we close up is the penalties. I pulled up the Cornell Law School website here with the federal code. 18 U.S.C. 924 talks about penalties for violation of these rules, okay? And the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Actually, I'll switch tabs here. I'll start with 18 U.S.C. 922, unlawful acts. And you'll see here, A1A, it shall be unlawful for any person except a licensed importer, licensed manufacturer, or licensed dealer to engage in the business of importing, manufacturing, or dealing in firearms. Okay, so that's exactly what we're talking about here with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and the ATF final rule regarding what it means to be engaged in the business. So that's 18 U.S.C. A1A, 18 U.S.C. 922 A1A. And then if you look at the penalties provision for this chapter, and you find A1A, I think it's in, I can't remember which. I'm going to scroll down here. May have to do a search. Here we go. A person who, with the intent to engage in the conduct that constitutes a violation of 922A1A, which is the provision we just looked at, shall be imprisoned for not more than 10 years. So this is a violation. This is serious business, okay? Running afoul of these ambiguous rules that the ATF has published gets you up to 10 years in federal prison. All right? So that's what we're talking about here.
Yep.
All right. Mike, one other thing we wanted to talk about before we close up is, this is not firearms related, but the U.S. Congress recently passed a bunch of bills. I talked about FISA 702, which is the warrantless surveillance bill. More recently, they passed, just Friday, passed a number of bills providing funding for Ukraine and Israel and other things. I think it was $95 billion in total. I know, wanted to mention that in closing here.
You know what's funny? Yeah, and the reason this came to light is, of course, April 15th is not very far in the past. For those folks who had to write a check to pay the federal government is also borrowing money at unprecedented levels. You've got a new son. I've got a new grandson born on Christmas Eve, and we're strapping him with this debt already. And this Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, lots and lots of money wasted by the federal government. And not only is it wasted by the federal government, it's a collection of power at the federal government level that doesn't belong. It's not what the founders intended. It's not what's a true characteristic of a federal system, which we have. And by the way, folks, you keep hearing about save democracy. We don't have a democracy. We have a federal republic. The founders understood the difficulties and the problems that come with a pure democracy. I'm not going to get into that, but this led me. So what we see the government taking our money, borrowing money, indebting our children. And by the way, the indebtedness not only is a taking as well, because it induces inflation, if you've been to the supermarket lately, but they take our money to infringe on our rights through the Safer Communities Act. But at the same time, they also take our money and put us in debt. And yesterday, we're going to send $61 billion to Ukraine. We're going to send 20-something billion to Israel. We're going to send some more to Taiwan. It's just astonishing to me, the utter disregard that our politicians have for the American people, have for our young people, and basically the theft. It's either theft through taxation or theft through indebtedness. And if you don't believe that the indebtedness is theft, just look at the inflation rate and what's going on. And, I look at this U.S. debt clock. I think you brought it up. Once again, we're at 34.672. Let's see if I get the number right. $1 trillion in debt, and it just continues to spiral out of control. So the only thing I'd like to say is follow up what your elected officials do. And we mentioned Todd Young, who I think is a piece of crap, voted for this Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Maybe he has some. I can't imagine
he has voted consistently against freedom. More debt, more spending,
and I can't imagine he's smart enough to articulate a reasoned basis for any of this. He gets. I'm not sure what he does. But our other person in Congress, 9th District Congresswoman Houchin, I understand from you telling me she did well and voted against some provision, the FISA Act,
the FISA reauthorization,
the FISA reauthorization, which is another way that the federal government spends your money.
And control. Remember, we talked about this episode is really about control.
Spends your money to essentially violate the Fourth Amendment
to control you.
She voted against that, but unfortunately, she, at least in my mind, and perhaps she's got a reason, but she voted for this Ukraine authorization. And what they're going to tell you is, it's a loan provision, or
it's for safety, it's for democracy, it's to stop evil.
The same, like I said, Goebbels will be proud of these, little 7-word sentences that they put out. The loan stuff, quite frankly, I'm going to look into that. My suspicion is the loan provisions, it's something crazy so that it will never become a loan. In other words, the Ukrainian GDP would have to be equivalent to the United States, and then it'll convert to a loan. I'm exaggerating, but my suspicion is it'll never be a loan, and we'll never see a nickel of it back.
So I put the U.S. debt clock up here that, like Mike mentioned, but one thing that always bothers me is politicians and people who consume the repetitive propaganda that they hear on the news are always looking for a bogeyman, whether that's drugs, whether that's guns, whether that's China, whether that's Russia, whether it's Putin, whether it's Hamas, whatever it is. They're always looking for some external enemy to fight. Our greatest enemy is here in Washington, D.C., spending your money to control you, to enslave you, and to enslave future generations. And we have to stop them before we can stop any foreign enemy. Okay. And that's exactly what's going on here with all of these things that we've talked about today. It's about controlling you with your own money. And I've got a couple of quotes that I want to share.
And if there's one boogeyman, it's that debt clock. Look at it, folks.
Yeah. This is a quote shared by the 10th Amendment Center. And I'm going to share this on the screen as well. If you don't follow the 10th Amendment Center, you should. They shared a quote from Thomas Jefferson. A massive government centralized power will invite the public agents to corruption, plunder, and waste. And it's shared with a picture of Congress doing exactly that. Capitol Hill voting for corruption, plunder, and waste. All right. And then the next quote. National defense is the usual pretext for the policy of fleecing the people. John Taylor of Caroline. And then finally, one last quote before we close up from Ayn Rand. Potentially, a government is the most dangerous threat to man's rights. It holds a legal monopoly on the use of physical force against legally disarmed victims. When unlimited and unrestricted by individual rights, a government is man's deadliest enemy. It is not as protection against private actions, but against governmental actions that the Bill of Rights was written. All right, so that's what's at stake here. The government is trying to enslave you through taking your money and indebting you to indebting you and future generations. They're trying to disarm you so they can control you and engage in corruption, pillage, and plunder.
Yep, and that's pretty negative. But here's some little positive. We got some Supreme Court cases that are coming out from the black robes there. Maybe they're going to be in support of the Constitution more than they are the pillaging by the bureaucracy and the politicians.
Well, here's the other positive spin on it too, and that's what this podcast is about. You can't fix Washington, D.C. You can't fix Congress. The vote is the illusion of control over Congress. Okay, you can't fix it. It's too far gone. But you can fix your community. You can fix your family. You can fix yourself. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's about taking control over the things that you can control and about forging freedom in your own life and focusing on the things, not Israel, not China, not Hamas, not Ukraine, not Russia. Focus on what you can control. Those are all things you cannot control. And through that, no matter what happens in D.C., you can have happiness, you can have family, you can have a cohesive, flourishing community. And that's where it starts. It starts from the bottom up, not from the top down.
And to influence others, perhaps think that way and to be skeptical as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's where we'll leave it. Mike, thanks for coming along again this week. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. As always, you can find us on YouTube, Facebook, Rumble, and all the most popular podcast streaming platforms. You can also find us on X at Forge of Freedom and at forgeoffreedom.com. Thanks everybody. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.